A homeless boy stumbles upon two abandoned babies. What he does next changes his life in ways no one could have imagined. That night, streets lay empty beneath the dim glow of flickering lamplights. The distant hum of the city had long faded. Amid the stillness, a lone figure moved with unsteady steps. Haley, her frail frame wrapped in a thin coat, shielding the two small bundles cradled against her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps, more from the weight of despair than from exhaustion. She had walked for hours, her mind clouded with thoughts she dared not speak aloud. A mother should be strong. A mother should cherish her children. Haley squeezed her eyes shut, shaking away the gnawing voice in her mind. She looked down at her babies, their tiny hands curling into the fabric of her coat. How could she explain to them, these innocent souls, that she was leaving out of love? That staying would only bring them suffering? They deserve better, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. As she turned the corner into a narrow alleyway, she knelt slowly, her fingers trembling as she placed them on the cold, unforgiving ground. One last moment. Haley's vision blurred with tears as she carefully unwrapped the threadbare blanket around them, making sure they were warm before she pulled away. She reached into her pocket, her fingers clutching a small, crumpled piece of paper. With great care, she placed it beside them. Her hands hovered over them, as if some unseen force still tethered her there, begging her not to go. The weight of her grief threatened to crush her, to pull her back into their tiny embrace. But no, if she wavered now, all would be lost. A sob tore through her as she forced herself to her feet, stumbling backward, her heart breaking with every step she took away from them. Then, without daring to look back, she turned and ran. Paul had seen many things in the streets: hunger, cruelty, desperation. But never had he seen anything quite like this. The 12-year-old boy had been rummaging through a half-toppled garbage bin when the soft cries caught his attention. At first, he thought he was imagining things. The streets were usually filled with distant echoes, sounds that meant nothing, that faded just as quickly as they came. But this was different. He crept forward, his bare feet light against the pavement, and peered into the alleyway. That was when he saw her. A woman, hunched over, shaking violently as she placed something on the ground. His breath caught in his throat as she bent lower, whispering words he couldn't hear before she turned and fled, her shadow disappearing into the night. Paul's heart pounded as he hesitated, his survival instincts telling him to stay out of it. Trouble found you fast in the streets if you weren't careful. But when the wind shifted, carrying the wailing of an infant toward him, something inside him stirred. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped closer. His eyes widened when he saw them. Two tiny babies, swaddled in a thin, worn-out blanket, their faces scrunched up as they cried for the warmth that had just been taken from them. Paul's gaze dropped to the piece of paper beside them, the hurried scrawl barely legible beneath the dim light. "Please take care of my children." Paul's breath hitched, a deep, aching sensation that had nothing to do with hunger. He understood abandonment. He understood what it was like to be left behind. A sharp gust of wind cut through the alley, making the babies whimper. Without thinking, Paul knelt down, pulling the blanket up higher around their tiny bodies. "Don't cry," he murmured, his voice hoarse, unfamiliar even to himself. He looked around, half expecting the woman to come running back to scream that she had made a mistake. But the alley remained empty, silent. Paul swallowed hard, his small fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. He had never taken care of anyone before. He barely took care of himself. But as he watched the infants shiver, their tiny fists waving in the air, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't leave them here. Gritting his teeth, Paul gathered them into his arms, his skinny frame barely strong enough to hold their combined weight. The wind howled through the empty alley, rattling discarded cans and whipping up loose scraps of paper. Paul barely noticed. His entire focus was on the tiny, shivering bundles in his arms. He adjusted the weight carefully. One baby nestled against his chest, the other cradled in the crook of his arm. They were lighter than he had expected, delicate, like fragile things not meant for the harshness of this world. He pulled the blanket tighter around them, shielding them from the sharp winter air. A flicker of movement at the alley's mouth made him stiffen. A group of workers strolled past, their laughter echoing briefly before fading into the distance. Paul held his breath, pressing himself and the babies deeper into the shadows. If they saw him, if they saw the children, what would they do? Call the police? Report him to social services? The thought sent a cold spike of fear through his chest. The shelters, the group homes, he had been through them before. Places that smelled of disinfectant and hopelessness, where no one looked at you as if you mattered. These babies deserved better. He looked down at them, their faces barely visible in the dim light. One of them yawned, a tiny fist waving feebly in the air. The other blinked up at him, eyes round and trusting. No one had ever looked at him like that before. Paul let out a shaky breath and forced a grin. "I guess you're stuck with me, huh?" he murmured, voice thick with something he couldn't name. The journey back to his makeshift home was slow, every step careful, deliberate. His arms ached, his fingers stiff with cold, but he clutched the babies close. They couldn't slip. They couldn't fall. When he finally reached the abandoned building, he ducked beneath the crumbling archway and crept toward the stairwell where he had spent countless nights. It wasn't much, a broken-down space beneath the staircase, its concrete walls stained with time, a tattered blanket serving as his only cushion against the cold. But at least it was his. Paul lowered himself to the ground and carefully laid the babies down on his makeshift bed. Immediately, they began to squirm, their faces twisting in distress before the first wail broke the silence. Paul flinched. Then another cry followed, and another. Panic flared in his chest. "No, no, no, don't do that, please don't do that," he muttered, running a hand through his unkempt hair. The babies didn't listen. Their tiny limbs flailed, their faces scrunched up in misery. Paul tried rocking them. He tried patting their backs. He even tried mumbling nonsense words the way he had once seen a mother do with her child at a bus stop. Nothing worked. They just kept crying. Paul pressed his palms to his temples, frustration mounting. Why had he thought he could do this? He had spent years looking out for himself, dodging trouble, keeping his head down. Babies weren't like that. Babies needed someone. Paul wasn't someone. And yet, they were here, and so was he. He exhaled sharply and pulled off his jacket, draping it over them. The cries softened just a little. Not enough, but it was something. It wasn't hunger that gnawed at Paul's stomach. That was familiar, manageable. It was the realization that the babies needed more than warmth. They needed food. Paul swallowed hard, rubbing his hands over his arms. He had nothing to give them. No formula, no milk, not even scraps of bread. The thought settled like a stone in his gut. His gaze drifted toward the city streets beyond his hiding place. He knew where to go, knew which stores stocked what he needed. The fluorescent lights inside the convenience store flickered slightly. Paul stood in front of the infant formula aisle, his small, thin fingers tightening around the edge of his worn-out hoodie. His stomach twisted with guilt and hunger, but the sharp cries of the babies back at the stairwell echoed in his mind. He reached out, hesitated, then quickly grabbed a can of powdered milk. His heart pounded as he glanced toward the counter. The cashier was distracted, chatting with a customer. This was his chance. Paul slid the can into his jacket, trying to still the trembling in his hands. His legs tensed, preparing to make a quick exit, but before he could take a single step, a firm grip closed around his wrist. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice was low but firm, carrying an air of authority that sent a chill down Paul's spine. He turned sharply, eyes wide with panic. A woman stood before him, her sharp, discerning gaze locked onto his. She was older than most of the people he encountered on the streets, her dark hair streaked with silver, her expression neither cruel nor kind, just calculating. Paul instinctively tried to yank his arm free, but her grip tightened. "Let me go," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper, aware that any commotion would bring unwanted attention. The woman raised an eyebrow but didn't release him. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the bulge in his jacket. "Stealing, are we?" Paul swallowed hard. He could run, bolt through the door, and disappear into the alley. But he knew he wouldn't get far, not with her eyes on him. He looked down, his breathing ragged. "Please," he whispered. "It's not for me. My siblings. They're hungry." The woman's expression shifted ever so slightly. Skepticism, suspicion, but also curiosity. Kate didn't let go of the boy's wrist immediately. She studied him, noting the way his shoulders tensed, the way his fingers twitched as if ready to bolt. A street kid, probably homeless. She had seen many like him before. They always had a story, and most of them were lies. "Siblings?" she repeated, her voice measured. Paul nodded quickly. "2 babies. They need milk." Kate's eyes flicked down to the can in his jacket. Infant formula, not candy, not alcohol. Something about that detail made her pause. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then you'll let me see them." Paul's breath caught. He shook his head violently. "No, no way. If I take them to a shelter, they'll split us up." The raw fear in his voice surprised her. It was real, not the manufactured kind she was used to hearing from kids looking for sympathy. Kate exhaled through her nose, making a decision. She reached into her purse, pulled out a few bills, and placed them on the counter. "I'll buy the milk," she said, "but you take me to them. That's the deal." Paul hesitated. His eyes darted toward the exit, toward the freedom of running. But then he thought of the 3 tiny figures curled up beneath his jacket, their soft whimpers, their fragile fingers grasping at nothing. His shoulders slumped. Fine. Paul led Kate through the darkened streets, his movements cautious, like a stray dog leading a stranger too close to its den. When they reached the abandoned stairwell, he hesitated before motioning for her to follow. Kate stepped inside, her boots crunching against the dirty floor, and then she saw them. Twins, barely a few weeks old, lay bundled in a tattered blanket, their tiny faces red from the cold. One of them stirred, a weak cry slipping from his lips. Another sucked desperately on his fist, searching for comfort that wasn't there. Kate felt the breath leave her lungs. "My God," she whispered. "How?" Kate's voice wavered. "How have you been taking care of them?" Paul swallowed. "I found them on the street. The mother left. I'll do what I can." Kate's chest tightened. She had seen a lot in her line of work, children abandoned, families torn apart. But this, a 12-year-old boy single-handedly caring for twins? "Paul," she said gently, "this isn't sustainable. They need medical care. They need—" "No," Paul's voice cracked. "If you take them to a shelter, they'll separate us. They'll put them in different homes, and I'll never see them again." His breathing was ragged, his small hands clenched into fists. Kate studied him, seeing the unmistakable terror in his eyes. "I'm not calling the police," she said finally. Paul flinched, clearly not expecting that. "But you have to let me help," she continued. "We'll find their mother. We'll figure this out together. I promise you, I won't let anyone take them from you." Paul didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, his shoulders sagged. "You promise?" "I promise." Kate didn't go to the police. Instead, she went back to where Paul had found the infants. She combed through the alley, searching for clues. And then she found it. A grainy image on a security camera feed from a nearby store. A woman disappearing into the night, her face pale with fear. Kate's heart pounded. She didn't leave them because she wanted to. She turned to Paul, holding up the printed image. "Now we find her." The dim light flickered, casting long, trembling shadows against the stained walls of the run-down motel room. Haley sat curled at the edge of the thin mattress, knees drawn to her chest, fingers clutching the rough fabric of the blanket wrapped around her. Her mind was elsewhere, trapped in the endless loop of fear, guilt, and exhaustion that had haunted her since the night she left. Her children. A sharp, twisting pain coiled in her stomach at the thought of them. Were they safe? Had someone found them? She tried to remind herself why she had done this, why she had made the unbearable choice to walk away. It was for them, to protect them. But the logic she had clung to was unraveling, thread by thread. And then there was Logan. The mere thought of him made her body tense. Logan Kane, her husband, the man she had once loved. He had never hit her, never raised his voice in anger, but his presence alone had become suffocating, a cage she couldn't escape. He was cold, distant, lost in the towering walls of his empire, a man who saw his children as an extension of himself rather than fragile souls needing love. She could still hear his voice, steady, calculated, filled with quiet disapproval whenever she failed to meet his expectations. "You're their mother, Haley. Act like one." She squeezed her eyes shut. I tried so hard, but it hadn't been enough. A sudden burst of static filled the air as the old television crackled to life, dragging her from her thoughts. The news anchor's voice was distant at first, words blending together in meaningless background noise, until she heard it. A missing persons case continues to unfold tonight. Haley Kane and her 2 infant children disappeared several days ago, leaving her husband, businessman Logan Kane, desperate for answers. Sources say Kane has enlisted the help of private investigators, searching every corner of the city for his wife and children. Haley's breath hitched. A grainy image of her flashed on the screen, an old photo from a charity gala. Her smile forced, eyes hollow. Then another image, her and Logan standing together, the perfect couple. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. "He's looking for me." Her hands trembled as she reached for the remote, switching off the television in a blind panic. The room was silent again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watched, hunted. And then, a knock at the door. Haley froze. A second knock, this time louder. Her breath came in shallow gasps as her grip tightened on the strap of her worn-out bag. She knew it was irrational, but fear had already sunk its claws deep into her mind. Logan found me. She didn't wait to find out if she was right. Without a second thought, Haley lunged for the door, not to open it, but to flee. She pulled her hood up, grabbed her bag, and slipped out through the back exit, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cold air slapped against her skin as she stumbled into the night, feet moving before her mind could fully catch up. She had to disappear. Again. Kate leaned forward, eyes scanning the flickering computer screen as a list of motel registries loaded in front of her. Her fingers tapped restlessly against the desk as she scrolled through names, stopping when she found the one she was looking for. Haley Kane. She let out a breath, motioning to Paul, who sat anxiously beside her. She was here. Just last night. Paul perked up. So where is she now? Kate's expression darkened. She left. Her contact at the police department had already called ahead, speaking with the manager of the motel. Haley had checked in under a false name, stayed a short time, then fled in a panic when something or someone spooked her. Paul's jaw tightened. We have to find her. Kate didn't need convincing. She had seen enough cases like this before, women on the run, trapped in their own fear, convinced that there was nowhere left to turn. If Haley had reached that point, they didn't have much time. The old church stood at the edge of the city, its once white walls now faded with time, stained by years of harsh weather and neglect. Kate and Paul stepped inside, the scent of candle wax and aged wood thick in the air. The priest looked up from where he stood near the altar, his kind eyes studying them carefully as they approached. "Can I help you?" Kate pulled out her phone, showing him a picture of Haley. "We're looking for this woman. Have you seen her?" The priest's gaze lingered on the image, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Yes," he said after a pause. "She was here." Paul stepped forward. "Where did she go?" The priest hesitated, his fingers grazing the wooden cross around his neck-eye. "She was frightened. She mentioned the old train station outside the city." Paul frowned. Why would she go there? Kate didn't have an answer. Kate exchanged a look with Paul before gripping her car keys tightly. "We need to go. Now." The night was darker than usual, the road stretching ahead like an abyss. As Kate drove, Paul sat beside her, his hands curled into fists. "You think she's okay?" he asked quietly. Kate didn't answer right away. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, eyes locked on the road ahead. "I hope so," she murmured. But in her heart, she wasn't sure. The old train station stood like a forgotten relic against the backdrop of the sleeping city, its once grand structure now reduced to little more than crumbling stone and rusting metal. Kate pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, a shiver running down her spine, not from the cold, but from the gnawing unease that had settled in her chest since they arrived. Beside her, Paul shifted restlessly, his young face set in grim determination. He had barely spoken during the drive, his body rigid with tension. Then they saw her. Haley sat curled in a darkened corner of the station, her back pressed against the icy stone wall. Her once soft golden hair hung in tangled waves around her face, her clothes stained with dirt and fatigue. She looked like a shadow of the woman in the photographs, fragile, broken, lost. Her knees were drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though trying to disappear into the fabric of her coat. The sight of her sent something twisting in Kate's gut. But Paul saw only the woman who had abandoned her children. "You left them," he said, his voice tight with restrained fury. His steps were quick, purposeful, and before Kate could stop him, he was in front of Haley, his small frame rigid with accusation. "Do you even know what you did?" His voice cracked, raw with emotion. "They almost died out there." Haley flinched as though struck, her entire body recoiling as she pressed herself harder against the wall. Her breath hitched, her eyes, wide and hollow, darting between them, searching for something unseen. Then suddenly, they filled with terror. No, he sent you, didn't he?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling like fragile glass on the verge of shattering. She shook her head violently, her fingers digging into the fabric of her coat as she shrank away. "Logan sent you to take me back, to take them away from me." Paul took a step back, stunned by the panic in her voice. Kate crouched down slowly, her hands raised, her voice calm but firm. "Haley, no one sent us. We're here to help." Haley didn't seem to hear her. Her breath was coming faster now, shallow gasps as though she was drowning on dry land. "I won't let him have them," she whispered, her voice rising with each word. "He doesn't love them, he never did. He just wanted heirs. Just like everything else in his life, they're just another asset to him. And if I had stayed, he would have destroyed us all." Her voice broke on the last word, and suddenly she was crying, deep, racking sobs that seemed to shake her entire frame. Paul clenched his fists, his own emotions spiraling between fury and confusion. He had believed Logan was the villain in all of this, had envisioned some monstrous man controlling Haley like a puppet, driving her to the point of breaking. "Haley," Kate said gently, reaching out slowly, "Logan isn't here. He doesn't know where you are. But we need to get you and the babies somewhere safe." For a long moment, Haley didn't move. Then, as though the fight had drained from her body, she nodded weakly. The hospital was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming softly above them. Haley sat in the sterile white bed, arms wrapped protectively around herself as a nurse checked her vitals. Beside her, a crib held the two tiny infants, bundled in warm blankets, their chests rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Kate stood by the doorway, watching the scene with wary eyes. Paul sat beside her, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn-out jacket, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. They had done the right thing, hadn't they? Paul exhaled sharply, shaking his head as though trying to rid himself of the doubt creeping into his thoughts. "We have to make sure Logan never finds them," he muttered. Kate hesitated before nodding. She pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the screen for only a second before pressing down. The line rang once, twice. "This is Kate Morrison. I need to report a case of domestic abuse." Logan Kane was in the middle of a meeting when the call came. He barely registered his assistant's words, something about the police before he was already out the door, his pulse hammering. The drive to the station was a blur of red traffic lights and impatient honking, but none of it mattered. The moment he stepped inside, a uniformed officer greeted him, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Kane," the officer said, "I need you to come with me." Logan's brows furrowed, his breath slow and measured. "What is this about?" The officer's gaze didn't waver. "Your wife has accused you of endangering her and your children. She has filed an official report against you." For the first time in years, Logan felt the ground shift beneath him. Kate and Paul were already at the police station when the call came through. "They've found Logan." Paul shot to his feet, his expression a mixture of triumph and anger. "Good. Now we can make sure he never gets near Haley and the babies again." Kate, however, wasn't so sure anymore. The room was sterile, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly as Logan sat across from the lead investigator. His hands were clasped together, resting on the table in front of him, his knuckles white from the pressure. "My wife is sick," Logan said, his voice strained. "She has been for a long time. I tried to help her, but she wouldn't let me. And now she's out there, alone, and I don't know if she's safe." The detective folded his arms. "We have reason to believe that your wife ran away because she feared for her safety." Logan flinched as if struck. "I would never hurt her. I would never hurt my children." he with quiet desperation. She has postpartum depression. It started after the twins were born. At first, it was small things, exhaustion, forgetfulness. Then, she stopped sleeping. She stopped eating. I tried to get her help, but she didn't trust me anymore. She started saying things that didn't make sense, believing things that weren't real. His voice cracked, and for a moment, the confident, composed businessman was gone. In his place was a husband, an exhausted, grieving man. She believes I'm her enemy, but I'm not. I just want my family back. Paul shifted uncomfortably in his seat on the other side of the interrogation room's glass panel. He had never considered Logan's pain before. Kate remained silent, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had spent years working with battered women, listening to their stories, helping them escape monsters. But Logan did not fit the profile of the men she had fought against. She wanted to believe Haley. But what if Haley was wrong? The room was heavy with silence when Dr. Mitchell arrived. The man walked in with measured steps, his hands clutching a thick file. He glanced at Logan before turning to the officers. "I've been Haley Kane's psychiatrist for the last 2 years. She was diagnosed with severe postpartum depression, bordering on postpartum psychosis." He placed the file on the table and continued, his voice calm but firm. She had been receiving treatment, but she missed several sessions after giving birth. In her current state, she may perceive threats where there are none. If she believes her husband is dangerous, it is not because of reality, it is because of her illness. Paul barely understood what Dr. Mitchell said. Kate felt her breath hitch. Had they made a mistake? Before anyone could dwell further on the weight of their realizations, the station's intercom crackled. "We have an emergency. Haley Kane has fled the hospital with the twins." Logan stood so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floor. "Where is she?" His voice was sharp, frantic. "Last seen near the old train station," an officer reported. "A bystander called in. She's holding a knife, refusing to let anyone near the children." The world tilted. Kate's vision blurred for a second. She wasn't running from Logan. She was running from herself. The police station burst into motion, officers scrambling to their vehicles. Logan was already out the door before anyone could stop him, his mind singular in its focus. "I have to get to her." Kate and Paul weren't far behind. Their belief in Haley's narrative had shattered, replaced by something far more terrifying. The realization that they might lose her, and the children, forever if they didn't get to her in time. The old train station stood desolate beneath the weight of the night, its skeletal frame shrouded in mist and silence. And there, in the center of the darkness, Haley sat with her children in her arms. She clutched them tightly, their small bodies pressed against her chest as if she could shield them from the world itself. Their warmth was the only thing keeping her tethered, the only thing stopping her from dissolving completely into the void that had consumed her mind. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks, falling onto the delicate foreheads of her babies. She stroked their hair, her fingers trembling as she whispered broken words, words of love, words of apology. "My sweet ones, my angels, I'm so sorry." Her voice cracked as she inhaled a shuddering breath. "I can't let you grow up in this world. I can't let you suffer like I have. If I can't protect you, then I have to set you free." Her hand moved slowly, almost dreamlike, reaching into the folds of her coat. Cold metal met her fingertips, and for a moment her body stilled. She withdrew the small, gleaming knife, the dim light catching on its blade. It was so light, so simple, and yet it carried the weight of an unbearable decision. Her grip tightened. She raised it. The first baby let out a soft whimper. Her hand shook violently. Then the door slammed open. Kate and Paul burst in. "Haley, stop!" Kate's voice rang out, shattering the silence, raw with urgency. Her feet pounded against the cracked tiles as she ran, her arms outstretched, her entire being focused on reaching Haley before it was too late. Paul was right behind her. His breath was ragged, his pulse roaring in his ears. But all he saw was the knife, glinting in Haley's trembling grasp. "No! No!" Kate lunged forward just as Haley's fingers went limp. The knife clattered to the ground. Paul dove, catching the blade before it could skid too far. His hands were shaking as he held it, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had faced danger before, hunger, cold, even violence, but this was different. This was something he wasn't ready for. Haley remained frozen, her body rigid as Kate wrapped her arms around her from behind. She didn't resist. She didn't fight. She just collapsed. Her whole body trembled as if she had been pulled from a nightmare. The realization of what she had nearly done crashed over her like a tidal wave, and for the first time, she saw not just her own suffering, but the faces of her children, their tiny, helpless faces, and she sobbed. I almost... Her voice broke into incoherent cries. She covered her face with her hands, as if trying to block out the image of what could have been. Kate held her tighter. "It's okay. It's over now. You're safe, Haley." But Haley shook her head violently. "No, it's not okay. It will never be okay. I almost..." Her words crumbled beneath the weight of her own horror. Paul stood frozen, still gripping the knife, his knuckles white. His whole life he had fought against being unwanted, against the feeling of being left behind. But this was something else entirely. This was a mother who had almost lost herself. A new presence entered the room, and for the first time, Haley felt him before she saw him. Logan. He stood at the threshold. His breath was heavy, uneven. He had run here following the chaos, but now that he was standing there, now that he saw her, he didn't know how to move. For so long, he had been a man of certainty, of power, of control. But now, he was just a man staring at the woman he loved, the woman who had once loved him, and he had never felt more powerless in his life. His gaze traveled over her disheveled form, the tears staining her cheeks, the rawness in her eyes. But he wasn't looking at the fragile shell of a woman he had once known. He was looking at someone who had fallen so far into despair that she had almost lost everything. And he had let her. He moved then, slowly, carefully. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his fingers hesitating before reaching out. His hand found hers, cold and shaking. Haley. The name was barely a whisper. She lifted her head, her tear-streaked face filled with so many emotions that he thought his own heart might break. And then she collapsed into him. He caught her, wrapping his arms around her as she wept against his chest, her sobs raw and unguarded. He held her like a lifeline, his grip firm, as though anchoring her to the world. "I'm here," he murmured. "I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Her fingers clutched at his shirt as if she were terrified that the moment would slip away. And, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Haley let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone. When the police arrived, they no longer found a woman on the edge of destruction. They found a mother who had just been pulled back from it. Kate and Paul stood back, watching as Logan gently lifted Haley to her feet, his hands steady at her sides, his presence unwavering. Paul still held the knife in his hand, but now it felt like a relic of a nightmare that had passed. He met Kate's gaze. "We were wrong about him," he murmured. Kate didn't reply, and now, finally, she had a chance to heal. It had been months since that night at the train station, months since the moment Haley had nearly lost everything, including herself. And yet, as she sat on the small porch, wrapped in a soft shawl, watching her children play in the tall grass, she realized she had found something she never thought possible: peace. Logan Kane had once been a man driven by power, his days consumed by meetings, contracts, and the relentless pursuit of success. But when he nearly lost Haley, when he had seen the raw pain in her eyes and understood how deeply he had failed her, he knew nothing else mattered. He had walked away from it all. The company, the board, the multi-million-dollar deal that had once felt like the pinnacle of his achievements. None of it compared to the quiet weight of Haley's hand in his, the sound of their children's laughter, the fragile but steady beating of a heart he had almost let slip through his fingers. So he had left the city behind, left the suffocating glass towers and endless boardrooms, and chosen this, a small house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky, a place where healing could finally begin. And every morning he woke up beside Haley, and every morning he thanked God she was still there. He went with her to therapy, sitting quietly beside her, sometimes holding her hand, sometimes letting her cry. He learned patience in ways he never had before. Some days were good. Haley would wake up smiling, tending to the children with a softness he hadn't seen in years. Other days, the shadows crept back in, the weight of her past pressing against her lungs, making it hard for her to breathe. Paul had always been good at hiding. It was how he survived. Until now. The first few weeks in Logan and Haley's home had been strange for him. He had slept lightly, always half expecting to be sent away, to wake up and find that this had all been a mistake. But every day, Logan would call his name at breakfast, setting a plate down for him just as he did for the twins. Every night, Haley would check in on him, making sure he was warm enough, that he had everything he needed, and then, one evening, Logan had turned to him, his voice gentle but firm. "Paul, would you like to stay? Would you like to be a part of our family?" Paul had stared at him, stunned. "You mean, like, permanently?" His voice had cracked slightly. Logan nodded. It had taken him all of 2 seconds to throw himself forward, arms wrapping tightly around Logan's middle. He hadn't cried in years, but in that moment, he had. Not because he was sad, but because, for the first time in his life, he knew he belonged. The late afternoon sun bathed the fields in soft gold, casting long shadows across the porch. Haley sat beside Kate, watching as the twins ran through the grass, their giggles filling the air. Paul sat nearby, absently twirling a blade of grass between his fingers. Then, without thinking, he turned to Logan and spoke the words he had been afraid of for weeks. "Dad?" Logan froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He turned, studying Paul's face carefully, as if waiting for the boy to take it back. Paul didn't. Instead, he met Logan's gaze, his voice quieter this time. "Is it okay if I call you that?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then Logan reached out, placing a firm but warm hand on Paul's shoulder. "Of course it is, son." Kate turned to Haley, her voice low. "You did it. You found your way back." Haley squeezed her hand. "I didn't do it alone." And as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, Haley, Logan, Paul, and the children sat together on the grass, surrounded by nothing but the open sky. For the first time in a long time, they weren't running. They were simply home. And that, my friends, is where their story truly begins. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, not the kind wrapped in a perfect bow, but it was real. A family built from pain, from loss, from choices that could have broken them, but didn't. Because love isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up. Again and again. And that's the lesson we take away tonight, no matter how broken. So, if this story touched you, if it made you feel something, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that dig deep into the heart of human resilience. And tell me in the comments, what does home mean to you? Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and never stop believing in second chances. I'll see you in the next story.